Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to See Our Conversations. Nadeem Ul Haque here again, trying to build a narrative on Pakistani, or on economics in Pakistan, let me put this, or on the economy of Pakistan. We in Pakistan, for some strange reason, we don't think economy. We think that someone from outside will give us money, or that we will find some cash somewhere, like for example, some minerals or some wealth that my great great grandfather left us so that we can have a lazy lifestyle. This is the Pakistani dream. This is the Pakistani vision that we do not want to work. We just want to somehow inherit wealth. But the rest of the world doesn't work that way. We really have to build our own economy and we have to figure it out. That's why we hold these conversations, because the economic dialogue is too superficial. Today, let me say that I've got somebody. I'm very impressed, very happy to meet. Well, I've met him before, but very happy to re-meet him. Mehran Gul. Mehran Gul is a product of Pakistan. He's a graduate of LUMS, went overseas, lived in many different places, now is in Geneva, and he's written a very nice book called The Geography of Innovation. And if anybody who's studying anything to do with anything in the world, he would be interested in that book, because the geography of innovation is a very, very important subject. Because all of us, when I grew up, innovation was Silicon Valley, period. There was nothing else happening in the world. And now Mehran says it's gone beyond Silicon Valley. We still think Silicon Valley is the heart of innovation, although China has challenged them. But I won't get ahead of the game. Mehran, whatever you like, say about yourself to introduce yourself more formally to the people, what you've done in the recent past, very quickly, and then move on to telling us what do you learn about the geography of innovation. Do we still depend on Silicon Valley, or how many people, how many countries in the rest of the world are catching up? And if so, why?
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Huck. It's been a while since we were last in touch, something like 12, 13 years ago that I came to your office. So thanks so much for having me. I think you've given a fairly comprehensive introduction to myself, so I probably won't add too much to that, except to say that for the past couple of years, really the thing that has been occupying my mind has been this book. And I just thought that I started researching the topic back in 2017, which I thought was for the first time, I began to see that there were interesting pieces of technology which, weren't necessarily American. If you look at the world that we grew up in, just about every major tech company, every major tech that we touched was from the US, whether it's Apple phones or if it is, Amazon or, Tesla, you name it. But, now, a company like Samsung, for instance, is the most popular smartphone manufacturer in the world. One out of four smartphones that are manufactured in the world are a Samsung. Spotify is the most popular streaming service in the world. The question of what is the most consequential company in the world, it's an interesting question which can have many different answers. Maybe it's Nvidia, maybe it's OpenAI. But the fact that a company like TSMC, which is based in Taiwan, now a $1 trillion company, the only purely private company in the world. I'm taking Aramco out of the picture here, which is more of a state-run entity. The fact that TSMC can legitimately be a contender among the most important companies in the world gives you a sense of the sorts of changes that we're seeing out there. And we very often talk about it in the context of China. And of course, what we are seeing in China is very important. A company like BYD, for instance, which no one even talked about 5 years ago, now manufactures and sells more EVs than the entire German car industry manufactures or sells any kind of car, gasoline or EV or hybrid. And the German car industry, for much of the time that we were growing up, was the most important industry, not just in Germany, but in Europe. And the fact that China has really run away with that industry with basically one company shows you that we really do need to look beyond not just the valley, but I would say we need to look beyond China as well, because we are seeing these companies come from places like South Korea. SK Hynix makes very important components in GPUs, for instance. You're seeing these companies coming from Sweden. Lovable is one of the fastest growing AI companies in the world today. Lots happening in Canada as well, which I think we can get into in more detail. I wouldn't want to monologue too much, but that was really the premise behind the book, which is not just that we need to look beyond Silicon Valley, but that we also need to look beyond this emerging US-China duopoly as well, which is not serving, this narrative is not serving the other 197 countries in the world.
Hmm. Hmm. No, fascinating. But you identify, if I remember right, you identify about seven major centers of innovation in your country, in your book. And it's interesting to see that China has caught up with the US. Yes, we all agree. But interestingly enough, if I can divert a little, the Iran Israel US war also shows that Iran is capable of innovating. I mean, Iran has surprised all of us because, like Trump, maybe I'm wrong, but like Trump, I also felt that America could knock, or Israel, both of them could knock Iran into the Stone Age. But Iran has fought back well, and they have shown innovation in the drones, in the missiles, in the artificial intelligence. So yes, so I think maybe that's a chapter you should have added in your book. You think that you should have added that chapter?
So I mean, I wouldn't comment on the geopolitics of it, but I think I discussed eight countries in the book. The question of which countries ought to be in there and which ones are not in there was a much more complex question than I had initially imagined. What are the most innovative countries in the world? Sounds like a fairly simple question, but since you've read the book, you would see that I use three different approaches, and you being an economist yourself would
Mm,
appreciate that the different endpoints that we choose for what we're trying to achieve would give
mm,
you a very different list
mm,
of countries. So in my book, I use three approaches. The first one of which is to look at how we generally have now come to understand the word innovation, which is how many billion-dollar tech companies do you have? How many unicorns do you have?
mm,
And I look at it from that perspective where you see a very conventional list, which is the US is on top, then it's China, then it's the UK, then it's countries like Israel, for instance, then there are
mm,
Canada, Germany, etc. But I also thought that this was a very reductive way of looking at things because innovation obviously does not happen only in new
mm,
companies. At a time when Nvidia is more valuable than the entire economy of Japan or India, it's hard to make the argument that innovation only happens in new companies. Nvidia at this point is over 30 years old, which in American terms is
mm,
practically an ancient company. And
mm,
so the second approach that I looked at was to look at cumulative market cap of
mm,
companies in different parts of the world. And that really puts things in very stark terms, where the US is really ahead, then it's China, and Europe is, even as a continent, like orders of magnitude less significant when you just look at it in terms of um, cumulative market cap. Just the value of one company, Microsoft, is more
mm,
than every single technology company in every single country listed on
mm,
every single stock market on all of Europe.
mm,
And at least Europe is still showing up to the starting line. The other countries are not even there.
mm,
And then the third approach that I look at, again, I try to explore whether there can be an alternative model of innovation which does not rely solely on venture dollars and chasing valuations. And that's where WIPO's Global Innovation Index comes in, which gives you a very unorthodox list where Switzerland is on top, then it's a country like Sweden, the UK, Singapore. And so I use these different examples of using these three different entry points into answering the question, what are the most innovative countries in the world?
mm.
No, so I mean, so I was just talking about the three different entry points that you can use to defining what the most
Yeah.
innovative countries are. There are plenty of countries that are not in there
Mm,
um, right now, and so I thought, like, after the first couple of countries, the field gets very tight very quickly. The question really becomes, why talk about Germany but not talk about France? Why
mm,
talk about a country like India but not talk about a country like Brazil?
mm,
Why talk about Canada but not talk about the Nordics? And so I had two options. One was either pick a large number of countries and go into all of them very superficially, or pick a small number of countries, which maybe give you a different sense of what innovation can be, and go into those countries very, very deeply. And I eventually chose the latter approach because there can always be another book where I talk about all the other countries like Brazil, like the Nordics, like South
mm,
Africa,
mm.
and hopefully that's something that we can sort of do later.
No, fair enough. But tell me, the monopoly on innovation still remains the US. China is
Yes.
catching up very rapidly. Others are coming into the system. But at the same time, sorry, let's first go there. Summarize, what drives innovation in any country?
So I think the typical answer that people would give you is to look at what's happening in Silicon Valley and itemize that list and say this is what drives innovation.
Hmm.
And that's always that ends up being some combination of saying, you need an anchor technical school like Stanford, for instance. You need lots of risk capital with places like, Sand Hill Road and all the venture capital funds that are based there. You need something like having lots of international talent moving there. I mentioned in the book how over half of San Francisco residents speak a language other than English at home. And what's become very common in the past 20 years is for people to look at just, all of these ingredients in the valley and say that every other country needs that as well. But, the book is essentially an argument against that because if you look at countries like South Korea, for instance, over there, the innovation did not really come from new companies. The innovation came from old companies. It came from companies like Samsung, like Hyundai, like SK Hynix, for instance, all these companies that have been around for more than 50, 60 years. Also, South Korea, not a place where you see a lot of immigration. It is, a very homogenous country consisting primarily of South Koreans, many of whom don't even speak English. And I would make the same argument about China as well. There isn't a lot of immigration that is happening in China right now. If you look at places like Beijing and Shanghai, less than 1% of their population was born outside of China, which is completely different from places like Toronto, for instance, where over 15% of the population was born outside Canada, places like San Francisco, even London at this point in time. So the reason why I think taking these case studies and going deep into them is precisely so that you can argue against this formulaic approach to saying, like the Washington consensus as applied to innovation, that like you just need to have these 5 or 6 ingredients and you will get the outcome that you need. And that's why I think, having a look at the AI ecosystem that has come up around DeepMind in the UK, for instance, or looking at why these middle powers of innovation like Canada, which many people might not know, but the reason why we went from not hearing about AI at all to just hearing about AI all the time over the past 4 years, the fundamental breakthroughs that made this happen in deep learning, they can be traced back to essentially 1 or 2 labs in Canada. And so,
Hmm.
how is it that a country that you otherwise don't hear about that much in technology, why does it play such an outsized role when it comes to AI? It wasn't because they had a lot of venture capital to begin with. And when you go and talk to people over there, they tend to say that the money follows the ideas. The ideas don't follow the money. And so, I don't think there's a list of ingredients. I think every country that has been successful has been able to do it their own way.
But look, I have a compulsion. I'm an economist or social scientist, and maybe an old style social scientist. I have to put a model to everything. I
Mhm.
can't leave things to kind of thing. So let me try and play the economist way. So I can put a model on this thing. Yeah, maybe it has a large residual, large component that I can't explain. But I think reading your book and otherwise, I come to a conclusion. And I'll tell you what, I recently had an interview with on one of my podcasts with a gentleman called Naveed Sharwani, who's
Mhm.
very big on the Silicon Valley and is now doing things in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia too. And we had a very interesting conversation. And it revolved around this, and I think that comes out of your book too, that innovation is based on 2 or 3 things. One is obviously, or maybe more, one is obviously talent. Whether it comes from outside or inside, somehow you are incentivizing talent to do something, right?
Mhm.
And you have to use your best talent to make things happen, period. It's like I was watching Survivor or Beast Games or whatever. You have to, it's like a competition. You have to play the competition.
Mhm.
The second thing that Naveed pointed out, which was very interesting, he said one of the reasons that Silicon Valley did so well was, which is related to the gold rush. He said that the gold rush people came in and they panned for gold. But if they didn't find gold there, they went to somewhere else and they panned for gold.
Mhm.
So it's the ability to take a risk and then also be flexible enough to move away from the risk, right? And not just get stuck. So if Pakistan is stuck, we're making textile. 4 generations we've been making textile, and we can't seem to move out of textile, right? I know when I was in the planning commission, a young gentleman came to see me. I knew his family, so I like to be provocative. So I said to him, I said, look, this is the third generation you're sitting on a textile mill. Why the hell don't you move on, right? The emphasis to my mind is on risk, not on capital. In Pakistan, the emphasis is on capital. So all these businessmen tell me, hey, lower the interest rate, I need capital. And I keep telling them, hey, where's the risk, right? Our businessmen don't take any risk. The third thing is the markets. You need the valuation from the market. You need the valuation. You can't do this that, hey, I'm going to take some money, like the textile mills that have been set up 60 years ago in Pakistan still don't have valuation. We don't know what it is, right? So you have to have a market. And the fourth thing is you have to have supporting policy and institutions, which you find in Korea, et cetera, et cetera. Would you put anything else in there, or do you think this is a model good enough to work with?
I think this is a model that makes sense, but I think I would still, take for instance a country like Romania, right? In Romania, a lot of even these ingredients would not be there. A lot of foreign talent moving in there. Not really when it comes to production of domestic talent, it's not really punching at the same level as countries like Germany, for instance, or Canada, etc. But an interesting fact about Romania is that for the longest time, the most valuable company to come out of Europe came from Bucharest. This is a company called UiPath, which went public uh, in 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 New York, I think in 2021 or 2022. And within a span of 6 years, it was able to create a company that is worth $36 billion. Now, if I were to take a company worth $36 billion to a context like Pakistan, it would by far be the most valuable company that would have ever come out of the country. And if I were to make an argument, I think it would be more valuable than probably every country listed on the stock market in Pakistan. Like, I don't know, like what the cumulative market cap of all companies, I doubt it'll be 36 billion because I was looking at the most valuable companies.
I'll tell you right now what it is. I think you're right. You're right. It's
Yeah,
right now probably about 25 billion. Yeah.
25 billion. So one company from Bucharest, Romania, whose founder did not even have a computer
No, it's
growing
a
up.
little more. It's probably about 40 billion. I'm wrong, but 40, roughly 38 to 40. So you're about right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. All I know is the most valuable companies in Pakistan are all around $1 billion. Like MCB, for instance, it's all these old companies like OGDC and all of that, oil and gas, banking, and they're around $1 billion. And these companies have been around for something like, 40 years, 50 years. They've been around, many of them, since the founding of the country. And the fact that it took them 80 years to get to $1 billion, and in China, you can see companies that were born 3 months ago that are worth multiples of that today, just gives you a sense of the gap that exists. That I think in Pakistan, in total in the country, there are maybe nine companies that are worth around $1 billion. I feel like if a country like Romania can build a company that is worth 36 billion, shows that there are people who are building these things in very constrained environments. That is not me making an argument, therefore we don't need to do anything. And if an entrepreneur has to be born, they can be born in very unusual circumstances as well. That is just to say that I think whatever model you throw at it, there is some exception out there. But that is not me saying talent isn't important, or stable institutions are not important, or having clean governance is not important. It's just that I think the environment in which South Korean companies came up was an environment that was, again, like this is 1960s, 70s, where I don't think they're offering clean governance or a corruption-free environment, and these companies came up despite what was sort of thrown at them. So I think the ingredients that you mentioned, I would prefer to have them, but I also am familiar of contexts where these massive companies that are the size of the entire Pakistani corporate sector have come up, even though the context has been very similar to ours.
Fair point. But look, I'm not going to say that this is a complete model. Obviously, there's no such thing as a complete model, especially not in social science, maybe in physics or something, yes. But the other side of the coin is there's another thing that I'd like to throw in, which comes from your book too, and which comes from other places too. You said something about a focal point, a university. I think that plays a very important role. A second thing, but again, we have to talk about that. The second thing which you point out in your book, which is also very important, is clusters and cities. The problem in Pakistan, as you know, probably I've been talking about it for many years. We have no cities and we have no clusters. We have urban sprawls and with no place where the young people can get together and form. What is that club that Bill Gates, etc., formed in Berkeley, where they used to meet? It was called some strange name it had, out of which came Microsoft and so many other companies, right? The making was that these things are also important. But let's go to Korea. China, for example. China is very interesting. I mean, the recent books that have come out in China, the New China Playbook and Ang's book and so many other books, they point to something that's very important to China, one that China did not. I mean, we are a moralistic society. We want to make sure everything is clean. And
Mm.
even the last cent that I spent has to be verified. I have to be very clean. I can make all the mistakes in the world, but no financial mistake, right? Every financial mistake is considered corruption. China doesn't have that. China actually decided that corruption is not so important. What is more important to grow the economy? Now they're turning towards corruption a little bit, but they still don't penalize corruption or confuse corruption with mistakes. For example,
Mm.
I could run a company into the ground because my idea was bad. I didn't manage it well or whatever, but it's not corruption. But here, if I run a company into the ground, my life is wasted because hey, it's corruption. So that's one thing. Now, why did China, for example, innovative? You've studied China well. Why is China so innovative? It's a government-led economy. It's a very strange economy in the sense that everything comes from the Communist Party. It's a totalitarian state, but yet Huawei and all these companies are trillion-dollar companies. What's happening?
So, I mean, I agree that in China, the state plays a bigger role in the economy and in the tech sector than it does in the US. But I'm not sure if you can exactly describe the tech sector in China as being a product of governmental policy.
Mm,
I think, for every incident that you mentioned of the Chinese government offering subsidies, for instance, to the EV sector, or all the to the battery sector, etc. All the things that are talked about very frequently. There are also examples that you can cite of the Chinese state absolutely trying to decapitate their tech industry as well. Because what is the emerging alternative center of power in China to this long-standing sort of control-oriented state? It is the tech industry. And if you look at 2021, for instance, all these companies that you mentioned, which were close to $1 trillion, they lost two-thirds to sort of one-third to two-thirds of their market cap, because companies like Didi Chuxing, like Alibaba, were slapped with fines that were in the billions of dollars. Their CEOs could not show their faces in public. Jack Ma left the country.
mm,
So I'm not sure. I mean, there are many sectors of the Chinese economy. I mentioned in the book that an interesting fact about China is that even though abroad, companies like Alibaba, Tencent might be the corporate face of China, at home, the largest companies in China are not their tech companies. The largest companies of China are these state-owned companies, like their state-owned banks, like their state-owned oil companies. And the tech companies are, near the bottom of the list of the largest companies in China. And
mm,
so I would see the tech industry as happening at a bit of a distance of the whole of the whole state-directed economy. If you look at how these companies came up, it was American-style venture capital. And in many instances, they started because of capital that came in outside of China. Temasek, for instance, from Singapore, was a big investor in many of these companies. It's been an investor in everything from BYD to Tencent to Alibaba.
mm,
So I think in many sectors of the domestic economy, especially the older domestic economy, I think the state plays a very big role. But I
mm,
think the state's role in China's tech economy tends to be a bit overdetermined, because people tend to look at all the subsidies, but they don't look at all the instances in which
mm,
the state has upended large sections. You will not find a good edtech company in China today because the entire education technology space was upended by the government. You
mm,
will not find a decent crypto company in China because crypto was made illegal by the state.
mm,
So I think when it comes to the tech industry, the state cuts both ways.
mm,
But the other things that sort of are working in their favor are things like their technical universities, where if you look at universities like Zhejiang, for instance, or Tsinghua, especially Tsinghua. they've really climbed the ranks of the most important universities in the world. And there are certain um,
mm,
rankings out there, very credible rankings. Like, for instance, Professor Simon Marginson at Oxford University, full professor there, comes out
mm,
with a ranking of technical universities in which 8 out of 10 of the top 10 slots are taken up by Chinese companies, Chinese universities.
mm,
So I think that maybe plays a much bigger role
mm,
than the state, which has, especially in the past 5 years, had a very uncomfortable relationship with specifically the tech industry.
mm, mm. No, I agree with you. State has a very difficult relationship with the tech industry. Yes, Jack Ma being a principal example. But then, what is it that makes China work? You say that they wanted to sort of create a EV sector, battery sector. They did, and many countries we give subsidies. We can't do anything about it. Africa gave subsidies. All countries try and make things happen. Why is it that China succeeded and we can't? So I want to put my finger on that. But let me take you to another direction. You probably heard of the book by Mazzucato, right? I don't know how
Yes.
to pronounce the name. Maybe
I
I
have
can.
I have it on my bookshelf.
Right?
The value of everything.
Yeah. So I mean, the point is, she makes a valid point, very good point, and she and Danny Roderick recently wrote a paper too, where they're pleading for a industrial policy. And yes, she's right, and we all know that a large part of the U.S., even Silicon Valley owes a lot to DARPA,
Mhm.
owes a lot to NASA, owes a lot to. In fact, there are stories of how Steve Jobs went to I don't know which part of the DARPA or whatever it was, where he copied everything from there. I mean, not everything, but he managed to get uh, the iPad technology, a lot, iPhone technology, a lot part of it from there. And we know that the moon landing helped the tech industry a lot. The human genome stuff as well. A lot of new stuff is coming out. So yes, the state has a role. And yes, in China, the state has played a role. And yes, there is a difficult relationship. Even now, in US, state has a difficult relationship with the tech industry, especially now. Um, I'm just trying to put a finger on it. What is it that we can learn about
Um,
innovation? That yes, government has a role, private sector has a role. Now, reading your book, I got this thing. Yes, we need risk capital. We need talent. We need clustering. We need um, talent to take its own lead, and we need risk capital to marry talent and take the risk to build something. And also reading other books, for example, Peter Thiel, etc., etc. They say a lot of things which I was never taught. To me, when I was growing up, failure was a deep sense of shame. I failed. I had to hang my head in shame and hide from society. Now they are saying no, failure is a path to success, and we must make room for failure. And lots of tech companies fail, and some people fail once or twice and then grow. So maybe failure is a part of it too. So I'm just trying to get how would you think about the genesis of innovation and tech, especially, putting all this together.
I mean, it's a complex set of factors which I think work in concert, and
Mm,
and a lot of that is time and place as well. And the reason why I say a lot of that is time and place as well, you mentioned the role that state investments play, and the fact that university like Stanford got a lot of money. So, and that's why I think the comparison between the US West Coast and the East Coast is such an important and interesting comparison to make as well, because very often, all these things that you mentioned, like state support, for instance, or tolerance for failure, etc. Um, all of these can be present in 2 or 3 different places, and yet one clearly wins out over the others. And in my book, I talk about the work of Dr. Annalise Saxenian, who's at UC Berkeley, who compared in the 1970s what was happening on the East Coast in the US, which at the time was the world leader in technology, with companies like Raytheon, for instance, IBM, all based in the Boston New York corridor. And then comparing that to the West Coast, where in the 70s, 80s, that's really where these companies like Microsoft and Apple were really just beginning to emerge. And again, people make a big deal out of the amount of defense money that went to Stanford. but it's not like Harvard was not getting money as well. It's not like MIT was not getting a lot of money as well. But at the same time, Stanford and the ecosystem that came up around it, clearly left all of these other places behind, which are still doing well, but not as well as Stanford, right? So, and in that case, the difference that she draws is really the role that, this very minor policy difference, which is the fact that non-compete clauses were more stringently applied on the East Coast than they were on the West Coast. And which basically meant that if you're on the East Coast, you are in the same company your entire life. Leaving your job is something that is frowned upon, and you certainly don't leave your job and go and work for a competitor. That is something that would make you a complete outcast. Whereas on the East Coast, on the West Coast, you had this situation where you could leave your employer on a Friday and go work for the competitor on a Monday, which meant that ideas and IP was floating around the environment much more freely. You mentioned earlier, clusters, and Annalise Saxenia's work really focuses on the difference between clusters and networks. We often talk about talent density, but we don't talk about relationship density all that frequently. You can all have all the talent in the same environment, but if they're not interacting very frequently, if ideas are not, floating around in the environment, then maybe having that talent is not that useful. There was a study that came out of Sweden, for instance, which talked about how, why is it that Sweden gets a lot of immigrants, but why is it that Sweden has not maybe seen the same benefit from immigration that places like Silicon Valley have seen? And the conclusion really was that for an average immigrant into Sweden, it takes them on an average something like 7 years to build a good relationship with just one local. The immigrant communities tend to be very ghettoized and not very integrated into their environments. So I think what you mentioned earlier, about state support, I think that is valid. Things about having talent clusters. I would add another layer on top saying, talent networks rather than talent clusters. Having, these minor things can make big differences, longitudinally, like not having non-compete clauses. I think the previous head of the FCC, Lena Khan in the US, made it a big cause for herself that non-compete clauses ought not to be enforced anywhere in the US. So I think it's not. I can't itemize a list saying it's these 7 factors or 8 factors. Also because I know that there are many false positives as well, where you can have all of these factors, 7 or 8. You can have the state support, you can have the talent clusters, you can have venture capital as well. Like, Boston, the idea of venture capital, interestingly enough, did not come up in the Valley. It came up in Boston, but there were very few takers over there, and so that's why it first took off it first came up in Boston, but it really found its truest expression in the Valley, and then was re-exported back into Boston. So I think everything that you mentioned earlier, having a high tolerance for failure, that's enormously important as well. Um, but I'm just wary of plenty of places I mean, there's always some element of serendipity in all of these things involved as well. I often give the example of the Nordics, where if you look at a country like Sweden, Sweden stands head and shoulders above its Nordic peers when it comes to not just business performance, but business performance, especially in the tech industry. Klarna is a Swedish company. Spotify is a Swedish company. Lovable is a Swedish company. If you look at Finland, if you look at Denmark, if you look especially at Norway, Norway has an even more well-endowed state compared to Sweden. I think their a sovereign wealth fund has something like the equivalent of $150,000 for each Norwegian citizen. And yet, in business performance, you would hardly be able to name any Norwegian company that is globally significant. Very similar culture to Sweden. Institutionally, very sound institutional frameworks. Contract enforcement, great universities, and all of that. And yet, Sweden stands out, and Finland, Denmark, Iceland don't really show up to the starting line in exactly the same way. So,
Many things come to mind, Mehran. I mean, it's a very interesting conversation, and it can go in many directions. And obviously, as I said, like a social scientist, we're always looking for some model. I would say any scientist looks for a model, basically. I mean, if you think about it, even the physics, all these theories leave a lot out. I mean, Newton came out with the theory of gravity. He didn't know what relativity was. He didn't know what quantum was. But we worked with that we still working with the Newtonian system, and we're getting a lot out of it. Yes, of course, the quantum and relativity are giving us much more new things. I'm out of my depth. I'm not a physicist, but nevertheless, I can say that. But the other side of the coin is, which is also very interesting. Venture capital, would you say, is purely a US phenomenon, or have other countries developed venture capital?
I mean, now you have deep pools of venture capital in lots of different parts of the world. Like, venture capital has gone global. In my book, I talk about how venture capital has become the language of innovation. If you think about it, like, there's no
No,
reason.
sorry to cut you. Everybody talks of venture. We in Pakistan talk of venture capital too. But do you have a Kleiner Perkins or all those other companies? I forget the names. Do you have something like that? These companies that can take deep risks for a long time. For example, I know Vinod Khosla has invested in energy projects for the last 20 years. He's trying to make these small nuclear reactors, etc. Elon Musk has got venture capital money that's allowing him to put people in space. This it's a very deep venture capital industry there. They're not looking for tomorrow's profits or the day after tomorrow. They're looking 10, 20 years out. Apple, etc., able to get money to research something for 20 years. That
Yeah.
kind of market is amazing. And I think that kind of market is fairly US. Nothing to do with the government. These venture capitalists are taking this risk.
I mean, I won't hold things against Pakistan over there, against Pakistan over there, to the extent that I think even Europe is struggling with that one. If the question
Yeah.
is, why doesn't Pakistan have, Andreessen Horowitz's and Khosla Ventures and Founders Fund, Excel, and all of these big names? Even Europe doesn't have them right now. I think Europe has one VC fund that could be considered. I can hear plenty of European people who would be disagreeing with me on this, but I think in the eyes of American VCs, only Index Ventures in Europe would be considered to be a global tier VC, and all the others would be considered still, not really in the same league as these big names coming from the US. And even in China, VC is not as developed as it is in the US. China, on the private side, the US raises 100 times more venture capital than China.
Exactly.
The,
So
the
why is
quantum,
that? Why is that? Why is that? Even Japan, for example. Japan, maybe SoftBank is there, right? Okay.
yeah.
But in Japan does not have this highly developed, deep venture capital industry. In fact, I would say some venture capitals are greater than sovereign wealth funds in the US, right?
Yeah.
So, I
So
mean, what can you put your finger on it? What's the story?
it's a question that so I think part of it is cultural, but everyone tells you about the cultural part. I'll tell you about the institutional part. The
Hmm.
maybe sort of 30 to 40% of this that is institutional is that look at where VC funds are getting their money from. I think that's a very important clue to this. And the LPs in the US, pension funds play a huge role in the VC industry. They're LPs in many of these top tier VC funds. And the way in which pension funds are organized in the US tends to be very different from the way in which pension funds are organized in Europe. In a country like Germany, for instance, when you make a pension payment, that goes out to pay for somebody else's pension today. So there aren't these stocks of capital that are being built up. In the US, on the other hand, if you're with CalPERS, that's the California State pension institution. In US, when you pay for your pension, you are actually building up for your own pension that will pay out 30 years, 40 years down the line. So that stock of capital institutionally is something that is completely missing in Europe. And even if these pension funds are so huge that like CalPERS would have over $1 trillion that they have for under management, and for them, even if they apportion something like 1% of their portfolio, they can risk 1% of the portfolio, 2% of the portfolio. That is on a systemic level an enormous amount of money to be spending on chasing
So
these.
you're vindicating the capitalist system. You're saying the socialized pensions are perhaps a problem in terms of arranging risk capital or venture
In
capital.
in this, I mean, I wouldn't be making this argument in ideological terms that like,
Yeah, fair enough.
therefore
Very fair.
capitalism is better than socialism, but like in the case of why venture capital maybe works a little bit better in California versus in Germany, I think this absolutely has a big role to play. I think another role is of exits as well. Like, in the US, you have NASDAQ, which is specifically geared towards technology exits. And it has lower standards for listing compared to the New York Stock Exchange, which means if I, as a 25-year-old, start a company, 2 years later, I can list my company, I can go public and start raising money from the public markets. And that is money that is not available in places like Europe. In Europe, you have 27 different exchanges. So whatever risk capital that you do have to begin with gets outcompeted with these competing centers. You're in 27 different countries, and most of them don't have the second technology focused stock market where highly risky ventures started by very young people can go public with lower standards so that they can at least within 2 or 3 years of starting their companies begin to raise money from the public markets. And that goes back, a typical VC is somebody whose time horizon for realizing their investment is much shorter than an institutional investor or even private investors who maybe measure their investments in decades rather than in 5 years or 7 years. A VC wants their return in 5 to 7 years. And so you need to have those liquidity events much earlier, which these technology focused stock markets like NASDAQ have.
There's another side to it. I have a couple of friends in California who are VC, venture capitalists. And what I learned from them is very interesting. I mean, I took a proposition. I didn't take a proposition. Some other friend um, eh, created a startup. So I sent him to my VC friend. And my VC friend told me very clearly, look, this is not my area. I will not invest in an area. It was very close to his area, but he said, I won't invest in this because this is not. For example, he said, I only work in, sorry, what is it? Semiconductors or something. I won't go into telephone. I won't go into this, right? The adjacent thing was very small. And secondly, what he told me was that he was very hands-on, that he was on the board of the companies and he'd spend roughly maybe a few hours a week in each company looking at what they're doing. So there's a very clear, sharp, close relationship between VCs and others, right? So that's another issue that the US has, which other countries don't have. When I invest in some country, I mean, not me, but anybody invests in Pakistan, becomes a passive investor. VCs are not passive investors, are they?
No, but it also depends on what VCs you're talking about. So I've certainly seen these highly focused VC funds as well that would be managing something like, $100 million, $200 million, writing checks of 5 to 10 million for each company. But I also have seen VCs, like if you look at Khosla Ventures, if you look at A16Z and Andreessen Horowitz, they would be investing in space tech companies, they would be investing in AI companies, they would be investing in energy companies. So I think the size of their portfolio would be like 20, $30 billion. So I think they're both. I think the idea of VC being a very specialized thing, that's how it started. I think having read the history behind VC, initially it was really VC was what was a typical VC? It was somebody who, you're a professor at a university, you know semiconductors really well, you're really deep into research, you don't want to start a company, but when you see a company that is working on an idea that is a leap forward in the state of in the state of the art in your domain, you kind of see it before everyone else does. And so you can go and write that check for $1 million and be like, okay, go chase this idea. Or you're a semiconductor executive and you know what the state of play is better than regular investor, at an institution. And so, you can back these companies. So I think initially it might have been that way, but now I see VC companies that are really playing across the field, not just across the field in terms of technologies, but also geographies as well. The
But
way
let's step back, Mehran. Let's step back. I also think maybe as you were speaking came to my mind, it's not as if VCs are new. I mean, think about it. I read it some time ago, William Dalrymple's book. What is it called? The uh, Anarchy. Oh, I forget the name. Anyway, you know the book I'm talking about, the East India Company book, right?
Yeah, right, the anarchy.
Right. East India Company was a VC outfit, right? There were a bunch of these traders got together and said, hey, we'll put in some money, go trade with India. And then they became hands off, and Lord Clive, etc., came and conquered the country, and they had massive gains. But it's a VC fund. Same thing. Okay, let me put it this way: take Columbus's voyage to America. That was funded by the Portuguese government, and it was like a VC venture. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they did. And there's lots of things I remember. For example, again, when I looked at the Medicis had a lot of innovation, and they were acting like VCs through their banks. So venture capital is kind of an old human tradition, except America has been able to US has been able to institutionalize it. We are stuck, and probably maybe because of people like me, maybe because of the World Bank, because we try and tell countries, hey, you must do this cleverly. You must have a bureaucrat sitting on top, and you must have this big thing. Whereas I remember you mentioned Khosla Ventures. I remember going to Vinod Khosla's office because my friend worked there, and it was nothing. It was no frills. I'm sure you've been there. It was just like a simple townhouse. Sandhill didn't impress me at all. Sandhill Road had no big companies, no big offices. It had very small offices, but yet it controlled the world. So I think, quite frankly, if we see venture capital comes naturally to us as human beings. But when you bureaucratize it, we try and take these things and we try and do them in a very bureaucratic fashion and we kill them. Maybe that's the reason we don't do it. But another side I wanted to take you to. We think of innovation as only technology. But I see there's a huge gain in the US. You talked about our companies. We've got 13 companies above a billion. That's it. So I mean, quite frankly, for a 250 million people country, 13 countries above a billion, out of which five are bloody government owned, five are multinationals. So we only got five companies that are above a billion private companies. Because we think of innovation as a very technological type thing. But if you look at Amazon, Amazon has created a service. It's got no technology. It's used technology to create just-in-time inventory and just-in-time delivery, etc. Take, for example, Starbucks. Starbucks is worth $100 billion and it makes coffee. Take Nike. Nike makes shoes that Bata used to make when I was growing up. And Nike is worth $50 billion. So I keep telling people in Pakistan, it's not just technology or whatever. I mean, when I went to Salcott, for example, Salcott has a sports industry. And no company in Salcott is worth more than $200 million. So when I sat with them, I said, you are all bloody small companies, not even SMEs. How come after three generations you haven't even got a brand name and you've gone nowhere? So should we think of innovation more broadly and just we haven't developed any processes? Take Walmart, for example. Walmart is nothing. Imports from China and sells stuff to us. But Walmart is worth also probably $100 billion now. So should we think of innovation more broadly than just tech?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's business model innovation as well. Like, if you look at, how Uber became a massive company, Uber didn't invent anything other than the business model. It didn't invent the phone, it didn't invent apps, it didn't invent GPS tracking. Yet it brought together this existing suite of, it didn't invent the car. It brought together these existing suite of technologies to create a platform. And that's a model that has been copied by so many other different companies, like Airbnb,
Airbnb.
essentially
Yep.
the same thing. So why can't, like, even if you say, well, our technical chops are not very strong, I think people just lack imagination where there is plenty that they can do um, with the existing technologies that just innovate on the business model level. Foxconn is one of the most important companies, if not the most important company in China. And if you look at I mean, there's plenty that's wrong with that company as well. But in terms of how it evolved as a business, it started in such a humble way. Like, it manufactured just the casings of the back end of the phone, the plastic casings. And then from there, it entered into, manufacturing other component parts of the phone to the extent that now, you cannot manufacture an iPhone without the help of Foxconn. So, yeah, I mean, you don't have to you don't have to invent the semiconductor in order to be able to be a technology player. You can also innovate on the business model level. And also, like, you can also the idea that innovation necessarily has to be a venture-backed company is also something that I push back against in the book as well. Like, if you look at a country like Switzerland, which tops the charts when it comes to the World Intellectual Property Organization's innovation rankings, you don't really find a lot of great companies over here. But what you do find is, things like the Swiss Transport Network, which is, the best in the world since 1960s. They've been running a train system that is entirely electric and entirely run on renewable energy. And if Tesla had done this in the US, people would have thought that this was the most important thing that has happened since the railroads came up 200 years ago. But since it's happening on a smaller level in Switzerland, nobody tends to notice. So yeah, so I agree. Like, it's not just that you need to invent a technology. You can also innovate on business models. You can also innovate on, how innovation happens. Like in Canada, they have these institutions like Vector, Mila, and Amy, which they're trying to, do something outside the university context in order to spur innovation in AI. So Vector, Mila, and Amy, and Mila are institutions that sit on top of the university networks, and they pool resources from different universities in order to help Canada compete in AI. So I agree with you. I mean, there isn't one model, there are multiple models, and you just need to go to different countries to see
But there's
that.
another commonality that sort of strikes me. To comment on that. Uh, I also feel that a lot of this innovation is happening on just contracting things. For example, Foxconn makes iPhones, right?
Yeah,
Apple designs things. I mean, Ronald Coase said that a long time ago that a firm is nothing but a set of contracts. And I think
yeah,
business is nothing but a set of contracts, right?
yeah,
So, but the contracts have to be enforceable. So if
yeah.
I'm making something for you and I can run away with your IP and I can run away with your business model, like when I went to Salcourt, those people don't even talk to each other about business because they're so scared of the competitor running away with what they have, right? But in these environments, when Apple contracts with somebody and they have lawsuits and Apple has paid fines many times, many countries, but they get settled very quickly and they pay the fine and move on, right? And yeah, Apple has paid many fines, many countries, companies have paid fines, but the things are settled very quickly. Capital is not stuck and they move on. But in a country like ours, or in these poor countries where we're still living with the colonial system, your judiciary can give you 20,000 stays, and you have you probably your case will not be heard for 20 years, and then eventually somebody will pay a bribe, and you will lose everything you have. What does contracting mean then? So can Starbucks? I mean, I'm always amazed when I tell people that McDonald's has never the CEO has never come to Pakistan, but yet McDonald's outfits are running here very well. No foreigner comes to look at them, but the franchise runs very well, operation runs very well. And I've gone to McDonald's and tried to bribe people into giving me extra hamburgers. They won't give it because the management system has been designed. But we can't do that. So is that an issue that you should think about?
Yes, but just to sort of add something to what we were talking about earlier, which is, the point that you don't necessarily need to have innovation only at the technology level.
Mm,
The most common analog that we often use it is India. I was researching this company in India. So India is doing very well in space technologies right now. They have lots of companies in the private sector that are working on space tech. I won't
mm,
name the company, but there was one company that abroad everyone was talking about, and it's a space tech company. If I mention the specific technology they're working on, like people will know who I'm talking about. It's an imaging company, basically. And when I talked to the CEO, a very young person, I was like, do you make your own? I was trying to figure out, like, what do they exactly do? They don't manufacture their own satellites. They don't manufacture their own cameras. The whole thing is like, imaging from space, but a specific type of imaging. They don't really manufacture their own software. They don't even send their satellites into space themselves either. Like, they use SpaceX in order to send the satellites up there. And all of these things, the satellites are manufactured by somebody else. The cameras are manufactured by somebody else. The software is manufactured by somebody else. And the delivery systems are made by somebody else as well. This young entrepreneur basically went around the world to places like Ukraine, to places like the US, and brought all of these components together and said, we'll take the satellites from here, we'll take the imaging from here, we'll get the venture capital from here. And
mm,
in
mm,
name, it is an Indian space tech company, but on the back end, the technical stack is not them at all. And
mm,
yet, just the fact that they're able to bring all of these components together into a viable business makes them one of the hottest space tech companies out there.
mm,
So, there are plenty of examples, like, not just, Airbnb and Uber. Like, people have been doing this at a smaller level as well, where they don't do anything themselves. There's so many AI companies, which are basically wrappers. They would use models made by Anthropic and OpenAI. And on top of these models, they would be building their own services. So,
mm,
they don't need the 100 developers and, $1 billion in AI spend every year. You
Mm.
can build an AI company for not that much.
Mm. But you see, this is the problem. In Pakistan, for example, and many countries, many poor countries, we've spent almost my lifetime, even more, 2 lifetimes, thinking about what we call localization and indigenization, where we say that everything on this phone must be made locally.
Mhm.
And in fact, if you look at any car company or anything, no country makes everything locally. I
Mhm.
remember an old article, 1950s, there was an article called, a paper called I Pencil, where the guy wrote an autobiography of pencil, and he said everything comes from, I'm a simple thing, pencil, 10 parts, but everything comes from everywhere, and then somebody puts me together. So the question is, do we, the fact that countries, I was just looking at this, for example, there's a company called SKF, which only manufactures ball bearings or some simple things like that. It's worth $100 billion,
Mhm.
right? Take Borg Warner, which just makes brakes. It's worth God knows how many $1 billion. And
Yeah.
the question is, does the environment allow this? If you have, like in Pakistan, do you think we can have something like that? Or is that a matter of governance? What is the matter of? Why can't we have this in Pakistan? Why can't shell code companies do this? Two things come to mind. One is contracting. This is R&D. We don't do R&D at all. And I was talking to the other day, I had a podcast with one of the big textile guys. And I asked him about R&D. He said, we don't need to do it. We don't want R&D because we let the Europeans make R&D. We'll just make low level products and give it to them. So does that make any sense? Or
I mean, I've seen variations of this. So first of all, like on the Pakistan question, I haven't researched it deeply enough, but just impressionistically, I mean, there's
mm,
so much that you would know about much better that on a fundamental level doesn't just work, which is, if you're an entrepreneur, at some point in time, you will end up in court because there will be a contract dispute, there will be an dispute with an employee, there'll be a land issue or whatever. Like, I just
mm,
think that, I mean, having had bruising personal experiences with Pakistan's legal system, I can tell you it is not a system that works, not even a little bit. Like, cases get stuck for, I have a piece of land on which there has been a case for 50 years. And I don't
mm,
know in how many other countries you can have a situation where for half a century, the
mm,
courts are just sitting on a matter and there's really no way to make the matter move at all. And, which is having had that, if I was an entrepreneur, would I start a company in Pakistan? Probably not, right? Because having seen how slowly the system works on very important matters, like what if tomorrow there's a contract dispute related to my company? I'm not going to waste 50 years on trying to solve a certain issue.
mm,
Even other things like, small things like moving money around is extremely hard in Pakistan. Moving, as in Europe, you move trillions of dollars across, borders every single day, and that's not a problem at all. In Pakistan, try moving $100,000, abroad, and it just, it'll take you a year to do that. And,
mm,
I think the system doesn't work on a much more fundamental level, which is why I've seen at Lums, I saw people who were globally competitive and who are now working in places like Nvidia and, in places like, OpenAI. There's hardly any company or graduate program that I can think about which I have not seen Lums graduates go to. So whether it is, HBS MBAs, if when I was in the graduate school at Yale, every single graduate student from Pakistan at Yale was from Lums, right?
mm,
And I've seen Lums graduates at Google. I don't think anyone thinks I'm going to graduate and start a company here because they know that on a very basic level, this will just not work. That
mm,
you'll run into problems with the bureaucracy, you'll run into problems. So just the hurdles are too much. So even if you have, I don't think the problem is, if the problem was just technical talent, I think Pakistan is producing enough technical talent to be able to produce, 50. If there's like $1,000 billion companies in the US, scale that down to the level of talent that Pakistan is producing, maybe we should produce five a year, right? Eight a year or something like that. But even those five or eight a year are not being produced, right? India has 100 unicorns at this point in time. Adjusted for population, adjusted for the number of universities, Pakistan ought to have 20, right? But it doesn't. And I think the reason is that even the talent that it is producing is looking at domestic situation and saying it'll be impossible to do something over here. And so they would rather leave than be like, we'll deal with the system, we'll deal with the bureaucracy, we will deal with, the people who create land issues, we will deal with the court system. So, I mean, I think looking at why innovation is not happening for reasons such as non-compete clauses or lack of venture capital, I think that might be a conversation that is more appropriate for China or maybe like South Korea and places like that where the debate has advanced much more. But with us, I think it's still more of the fundamental things, like, is the base
Mehran,
layer.
what comes to mind very interestingly, just when you were speaking, I just thought about it. If you go back again, back to the Medici era or whatever, the old time, um, the traders were basically trading. And what were they doing? They were sending ships overseas to pick up spices, and they were picking up silk or whatever from China, and they were trading those things. But they had a complex system of managing things. For example, you know about that. I would invest in a ship. I would own a portion of which they call the bottom. I'd own a portion of the ship. And then when the ship came back, I'd collect on it. But they had a legal system backing it. And what happened was the court system wasn't working. So these guys, they have no rights, and many people, that these guys actually developed what was called a law merchant. That the law merchant was like he set up laws and set up rules of the system, and they all respected it. They made it work. Now in Pakistan, in these countries, somehow we haven't worked out the governance system yet, which is friendly to the tough contracting that this system. I mean, I shudder to think the contracts that venture capitalists write. I mean, I don't think I'd be able to make head or tail of them. And the contract that Elon Musk and Costa are writing, they must be so complex and so strange. I don't think we'd have a judge who'd look at it, right? And similarly, the contracts that we are signing on Human Genome Project, or even the Apple components as well, there are tons of little things that work. I mean, just the bloody glass on the screen, the Gorilla Glass or whatever they call it, is a hugely complex thing. And I don't think we have the capability of doing that. So how do we develop something like that? Or can we?
I mean, Dubai has done that, right? If you look at DIFC, it has its own courts.
Yeah.
So I think you have had these, like you talked about innovations earlier, like not being just technical. They innovated
Right.
on the judicial level of
Yeah.
saying that any dispute that arises inside of this building will be dealt with by courts that exist within this building. And I
Mm.
think that's an interesting way to solve that problem. But at the same time, the permission to do that still
Mm.
comes from the established institutions. Like, if the ruling, monarchy in Dubai does not allow that, then you will not have these highly specialized courts that operate within the DIFC to do their jobs. So I think you've seen examples of that happen in other places, but the question is, can anyone implement that within Pakistan? I think the superior courts will not allow that because they will see that as, I don't think I'm yet to meet a judge who does not think that, they're smarter than everyone else in Pakistan. And so I don't think, and I mean, you would know better than I would that the quality in the judicial system is very variable, even at the level of the Supreme Court. There are some people that I would meet who I would think, would not qualify for very basic jobs anywhere else, in the judicial system. And I don't think they realize that. I don't think they realize just how um, inadequate their own understanding of the law is.
Mm.
So
No,
how
but
do you make something?
there's also a matter of ego there. For example, one thing that I've been contesting with, and I'm writing a lot about it, they won't take testimony. For example, if Apple and Samsung have a dispute, I don't think any judge can look at it. It has to
Yeah.
be some technology guy who will give an expert testimony, parse out the problem. Like, for example, our problem with the Recodic. The Supreme Court banned, not banned, but got rid of Recodic, the contract, the rule threw out the contract, without realizing that there were ramifications of contract in international circles, and without realizing that that contract, Supreme Court may not have taken the right decision. But instead of taking some expert testimony, all they had to do was call an expert who would look at the contract, the mining contract, they're very complex, and come out and tell the Supreme Court, advise them, hey, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. So we got a $7 billion fine because the Supreme Court didn't want to take testimony. right? Same thing on car care. I can go through the list. The problem is that we still haven't got those complex systems that are required in this complex environment, where, for example, one case that I was written about recently is this building that was built in Islamabad, One Constitution Avenue. The Supreme Court took a decision 15 years ago to close it down, and today that building is depreciating. Half of it is built, half of it is not built. The stuff that is not built is decaying. But the Supreme Court is sitting there very arrogant. Hey, I stopped something. I stopped something. Wow, what a great thing to do. And all they did was pass the building on to CDA. Whereas in the US, for example, as I said, if this had happened, it would take 5 days for the building to be resold. And resources move very quickly. As I said, I mean, every time I open up some financial news, I hear about Apple paid a fine, so-and-so paid a fine, so-and-so did this. They settle disputes like this and move on, because resources don't remain idle. Because if you keep the resource stuck, then and in dispute, the whole society loses. So that's a huge issue. I don't know how to deal with that. So in a sense, let's summarize what we learned. I mean, you give me your thoughts. My thought is that yes, we need talent. Yes, we need markets. Yes, we need, I think the term you use is much better than clustering, networks. Networks of knowledge is very important. That's extremely, extremely important. We need networks. Even the Medicis had a network of knowledge. The merchants had a network of knowledge. We don't. And at the same time, a state that is flexible, adaptive to the needs of the modern day, because needs keep changing all the time. In fact, with artificial intelligence, needs have changed again. I mean, with artificial intelligence, maybe we need to change our education. Lots of things need to change. And are we ready and adept enough to do it? Because we've still got the old civil service system, where there are kids your age who are sitting there for 1 year memorizing stuff that they'll never need for the rest of their life. And then they take an exam, and after that, God knows what they do. So this kind of a system. I don't know. So this is the kind of thing that I think we need talent, we need risk capital, and emphasis on risk, not capital. We need networking, and we need a conducive system. And in that, you throw in something very important: venture capital, pension funds, etc. Also, I wrote a book some time ago based on complexity. Life and everything is a complex system. So financial markets have to interlink. We can't have this S&P, stock exchange is sitting so independent of the rest of the financial system. There's no interlinkage, and you have to have that interlinkage. US is a very complex and a very interlinked stock market. So this is my summary. What do you think? You want to add something to it, or?
No, I agree. And, just two more points. One is, I think, having a bridge with, first generation, second generation Pakistanis who grew up abroad. I think if you look at places like India, the diaspora has played a massive role in helping the tech industry. I don't see the Pakistani diaspora playing a role in a similar way at present. And the other point is all the problems that you mentioned. I think all those problems are real. But even if I put all of those filters in, I think we're still underperforming, right? In the sense that the analogy that I gave you earlier, which is there is, given the talent base that exists, even if it's modest, the outcome that we're getting from that modest talent base could be much better, right? The quality of talent that you're getting from places like, FAST and NUST and LUMS and a bunch of other technical universities, all of that talent is being lost. And even without making these systemic changes, I feel like we have modest inputs, but even based on those modest inputs right now, the outcomes are not commensurate with those inputs. And people need to think about why that's the case. And I think a lot of that is just the friction that exists with talent operating in the country.
Very good point. But let me throw this last thing at you. It just occurred to me. We have one success: the nuclear bomb. The government put its mind to it. This is what Mazakuta calls the mission-driven economy. So we made it a mission. Bhutto said we'll eat grass and we'll. So we made the bomb. And kudos, good job, right? But we stopped there. Now, let me put it to you this way. How did we make the bomb? It was like our Manhattan Project. We put our best talent to work, put them under the aegis of the army, no questions asked, gave them money, no auditing, and just told them, go with the mission, do it. Now, if we have similar things, if you can do that, if you have, let's say, can we make a DARPA? Can we make a government fund like a venture capital fund like that? Can we revive things like we've got some research facilities here or some major universities? Nust, etc. that you're saying, fast lumps. Can we use them? Be selective. Right now, we're trying to fund everything under the sun. Very. If we can do it selectively, if we can draw the diaspora into managing these things and not have the local bureaucracy, is that a solution that you see? Is that something that you think might work? It's not an exact model. It's a stab in the dark, but what do you think?
I mean, not a model that I've looked at very closely, but I think,
Mm.
I mean, why not? I mean, I mean, the state has capacity to take on big projects. Like, I don't doubt that, right? And it's not as if in 80 years, nothing big has been achieved. Like, there have been highways, there have been a couple of universities, there have been certain successes that are there as well. Like, if you look at all of the sudden today, Pakistan has suddenly become geopolitically very relevant. I did not see that coming. That was not on my bingo card for 2026 that it would play such a huge role in so many different sort of contexts. So um, I still think that given the fact that it is such a massive country, I don't think people abroad really realize how this is a country that is of the same magnitude as France, Germany, and Italy combined. In terms of population, it is one of the top big,
Mm.
one of the six largest countries in the world.
Mm.
I don't think the weight that it has on the international level is commensurate with that.
Mm.
And I see this map of China from 40 years ago, where every single region of China was poorer than every single region in Africa. And if you look at those two maps side by side today, it is exactly the opposite, where every single region of China is richer than every single region of Africa.
Mm.
So, um,
Mm.
I don't think if you would have looked at China 50 years ago, you would have seen a country that was that different from Pakistan. And yet, if you look at China today, it is a country completely different from Pakistan.
Right.
So, there's no reason why, if it can happen literally right across the border over there, that it can't happen over here.
Hmm. Hmm. Fascinating, Mehran. Thank you very much. That's been a wonderful conversation. Learned a lot from your book. Keep writing, keep doing things. I think your next book should be venture capital funds, maybe, or something like that. I think there's a lot of stuff to be learned there. How can we apply this? The World Bank has tried to create venture capital funds here, and we failed. Lots of lessons to learn. And I think you're right. The diaspora people like you have to play a role. And I hope we can give you room to play a role. What worries me, what's sad, is I keep telling people that we want everybody to either stay abroad or come back. They don't. We want, as I say, bending the knee. The greatness of England, the way they conquered us, and I keep talking about it. The greatness of England is they recognized talent very early on. I wrote about this a long time ago. King Arthur's legend recognized talent. Sir Isaac Newton was knighted at the age of 26 and given the Keeper of the Mint. William Shakespeare was knighted. Walter Raleigh was knighted, etc., etc. What is the discoverer of the scientific method was the Chancellor, Lord Chancellor, and was also discovering the scientific method on the side. Countries that respect talent win. I hope we grew up to do that. Thank you very much, Mehran. Inshallah, we'll remain in touch. Okay?
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
All the best. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you.